Welcome again, everyone. Today we're continuing in 2 Corinthians, this time with chapter 8, by way of summary and bringing us up to speed. In chapter 6, Paul was discussing about our need to come out of the world and that we're God's temple. In order to be his temple, we need to come out of the world. And Paul reminds them, look, I'm not commanding you in certain areas, but only to continue in this. Meaning he wasn't commanding, he didn't command them to take up this offering, this collection that would be taken to Jerusalem. He wasn't commanding them how they did that. He was simply assisting them and reminding them to continue in this. Not just by way of correcting others. It's something I picked up on years ago. It's much easier to work with someone when you have opportunity to recognize what they're doing right and you focus on that. And then when matters come up that you need to be corrected, you have a foundation, you have a relationship that you can do that. If we're always just pounding on each other, correcting each other, if we're always angry or judgmental, we retract, don't we? We pull back. We don't like to be in those relationships because they're draining, they're hurtful, all of these things. So it just by way of a side, notice how Paul is reaching out to them in the things that they do right. And then when he needs to say something, he's not just negative all the time. It's a good principle to have for us as well. So verse 9 here, 2 Corinthians 8, for you know the grace of our Lord and Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might be rich. Now, one thing that's not really talked about much at all in the life of Jesus Christ was that the gifts that the wise men, as they're called, brought Jesus Christ were not trinkets. Oftentimes we think they're just kind of token items. They were not. It says they brought gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, and every one of those have kind of a symbolic meaning. I won't get into that aspect of it, but every one of those things were extremely valuable. And in that way, Jesus Christ was very wealthy, even as a boy, when they brought these gifts. The question arises, what happened with that? What did he do with that? And we don't know. My take, for what it's worth, is that perhaps Jesus used it to support the family after the death of Joseph. This was a problem in the Roman culture, and even in the Jewish culture by this time. Widows and orphans were vulnerable. That's why you hear Christ and the apostles talk so much about taking care of those individuals. They didn't have the safety net that we have in our modern societies with social programs. Family was supposed to take care of them, but again, reflect back on how many times Jesus healed someone and they had no family taking care of them. And on rare occasion, like the fellow that he had 4 friends that lowered him through the roof where Christ was speaking, that was unusual. It was the men sitting by the pool that couldn't get in. It was the blind man seeking alms. It was these people on the margins that had nobody to help them. Christ walked away from that wealth in the sense that did not define him. He probably used it in some way like this. If it wasn't for his family, I suspect at least part of it was. It might have been used for his other travels. We have no clear record of what happened from the age of 12 until the age of 30. Maybe he used it to travel to some of the areas where the 10 tribes were. Because it said he was sent to the lost sheep. The gospel account is pretty much focused on, the 2 tribes, with Levi and Simeon scattered in there a little bit as well. But Christ didn't live a life of wealth, even in terms of his physical life. The richness, if you will, of having access to things, or even just to live his own life, he even set that aside, didn't he? He became poor in the sense that he didn't focus on what he wanted to do. He came to do the will of the Father. And as Paul says here at the end of verse 9, that you through his poverty might become rich. Through the poverty of Jesus Christ, we have our calling. We have the blessings that he gives through his grace and mercy. We have access to the Holy Spirit. We could never buy that, could we? What would we spend to buy that? if we even could. But he's invested in us in that way. So then verse 10, I give a judgment in this, for this is expedient for you, who were the first to start a year ago, not only to do, but also to be willing, going back to this collection that was taken up. But now be complete in doing this. So he's encouraging them here not to give up on this. Humanly, it is so very easy for us to start a project and we either get frustrated or we get distracted or something else comes up and we never finish it. Could be a book, could be something of a hobby, we've started and we've never gotten back to. It could be any number of things. So he's just encouraging them here. Look, you started this, he says, over a year ago. So just see it through. Make sure you finish it up. He says, again, verse 11, but now be complete in doing also that as there was the readiness to be willing, so there may be the completion also out of your ability to finish what we start. And that's especially important spiritually. So again, not asking for a show hand or comments, but many of us have been around a fairly long time, decades. How many people have we seen over those years that started in terms of the calling that God gave them? They responded to whatever it was that God used, whether it was television programs, whether it was booklets, magazines, study material, whatever, other members, whatever it was. And yet, how many have quit? How many have given up before it was finished? So he's reminding them here, make sure you see it through. Verse 12, for if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what you have, not according to what you don't have. So maybe, he was sensing or seeing that their energy for this, their enthusiasm for this, the desire to see it through maybe was starting to wane because, again, going back to verse 2, maybe they began to think it should be more, it should be better, it should be whatever. And he's reminding them here, look, just make sure you finish it, but don't think that it has to be more than you can give. Now, God's Spirit in us, ideally, we want to do our best, don't we? We want to give to every effort that we can. We want it to be so much better, but sometimes we just don't have it. It's just the reality. In that way, it's not so much what we do or what we give in those things, but rather the heart. And this is what Paul is praising them on here. He says it's acceptable. Again, verse 12, it is acceptable according to what you have. What you're giving is really good. So don't beat yourself up that it's not enough or it's not as good as you would want it to be. Verse 13, for this is not that others may be eased and that you be distressed. The reason you're doing this is not so that you then substitute or you switch places. You become poor so that Jerusalem can become rich. I'm using those in very general terms. You don't do so much for Jerusalem that you have nothing to take care of yourself. Because then who would help them? It would be an endless cycle, wouldn't it? God doesn't ask us to do that. So Paul's reminding them here. So he continues the thought. There's an unfortunate verse break there. So verse 13 again, for this is not that others may be eased and you distressed, but for equality. See, this is the thing. We don't do our giving. We don't do these things. We shouldn't do these things. So there's a quid pro quo, a tit for tat thing. But on the other hand, because of the way God works, the principle of more blessed to give than to receive. Well, who's giving, who's receiving? Okay, so in this case, Jerusalem's receiving things, whether it's money, whether it's goods, whatever it is, they're receiving things, aren't they? So you say, well, then it's the Corinthians that are giving. Well, yes, but on the other hand, those in Jerusalem are giving the opportunity to the Corinthians, and the Corinthians are receiving a blessing because of doing this. So it's not a zero-sum game. This is the equality that he's talking about here at the beginning of verse 14. We cannot outgive God. And when he sees our heart and our desire to take care of one another, to serve one another, to give to one another, then he provides to us. It may not be exactly what we think it should be. It usually is in a way that we didn't even anticipate. But this is just the nature of God. So as the members in Corinth are giving, other congregations, if the Corinthian congregation would need something at some point, it would probably come back around to them. So it's not karma, it's God's principle of giving and receiving. So to finish verse 14, he says then, but your abundance at this present time supplies their lack, that their abundance also may become a supply for your lack, that there may be equality. So what abundance did they have? Well, previous to this, their abundance this is where Christ started his church. And we read of that in the beginning part of Acts, the thousands and thousands of mostly Jews that responded. But even as the Gentiles began to come into the churches, God called them, gave them his spirit. Look at how many men went out from Jerusalem. Even Paul was used as God corrected him, struck him down in Acts 9 and changed him, converted him. He went off to Tarsus, didn't he? Didn't go back to Jerusalem. He went out, and we read of Barnabas, we read of Silas, all this kind of ripple effect that comes out of what God started in Jerusalem and how much they gave, and sending out these men to establish churches of God in other places. So this is what he's talking about here. So let me read it again. So your abundance at this present time supplies their lack. What you're doing right now is helping them because they don't have enough. But notice that their abundance may also become a supply for your lack. So he's reminding them this ebbs and flows, this comes and goes. And so he finishes with the same thought, that there may be equality, that the favor can be returned at some point. And this is what we do. This is what we should do, to take care of one another. Verse 15, then, he quotes from Exodus 16. Now, this was the gathering. In Exodus 16, this was the gathering of materials for the building of the tabernacle. And they gave so much, didn't they? They had spoiled the Egyptians. They had so much, and they were so energetic. They were so excited with what God was doing with them, their deliverance, and to be able to worship the Creator. They just gave and gave and gave. And finally, God had to tell Moses, just tell them, stop, it's enough. And so Paul quotes from this, verse 15, as it is written, he who gathered much had nothing left over, and he who gathered little had no lack. God takes care of us. It's very easy with human nature to become very selfish. Some of the most generous people I've known, going back to the example up in verse 2 with the reference to the widow in Mark 12, some of the richest people I've known, some of the most generous people I have known are people that don't have anything to give. They're giving up their time, they're giving up their love, they're giving up their support, their encouragement, all of those things, even if they don't have money. And some of the cheapest people I've known are people that have wealth. They want to keep it. They're scared of losing it, so they become very selfish. It's not universal. I'm not saying it is, but it is very easy humanly. You look at somebody like Jeff Bezos and the money that he has, and that's known. It has been said by many that the sheiks in Saudi Arabia and Emirates and these various nations over there, they don't even report their wealth. Who knows how wealthy they are? And you look at some of the homes and the cars they drive, and they just, it's focused on them. It's not focused outside. And so this is what he's talking about here. We can't outgive God. Not that we have to try, but when we make sacrifices that reflect his character, then he's going to bless those things. And it's good to reflect on those, the times that, I had nothing and God blessed me with something. And I look back and it was because I was living the life. And then I need to remember in those good times that come along to turn that around, as Paul says in verse 14 here, to make sure that I do the same for others, that I reach out and help others when I have opportunity and means to do so. So then verse 16, to continue the thought here, Paul says, but thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you into the heart of Titus. So what he's saying here is God has given you that heart. Thanks be to God who puts the same earnest care for you into the heart of Titus. So he says, this is where he transitions now to talking about Titus. And Titus is just an example, but it shows someone who has a willing heart to serve. The one thing I can't teach somebody, I can teach them a lot of things. I can go through scripture. I can help explain doctrine. If God's Spirit is working with them, I can teach them those things. I can help encourage them in the soft things, if you will, in terms of what we've talked about here, giving and serving and so forth. I can encourage them in those things, but what I cannot teach them as a skill is having the heart to serve. That has to come from God. That's internal. And this is what he's talking about here. Titus had that heart to serve. I mean, just in travel alone, in our modern world, travel is so much easier than in the Roman world. It can still be onerous depending on where you're going. You know, some of the guys in United that serve in these international areas as senior pastors, you know, in some cases it can take them still 2 days to get to somewhere, just because even though planes fly these places to make the schedules and get there. And then to get there, you know, they don't always have the same comforts we have in this country, certainly, especially in Africa and places like that. The roads are terrible, you know, so you can't make good time. It may not be great distances, but you get beat up on those roads. They're just not taken care of. They don't have the means to do so like we do here. You know, you're not in your own bed. You don't have your own pillow. You know, all these kind of comforts that we get used to, but they have the heart to serve. And this was Titus, verse 17 here. For he, Titus, indeed accepted our exhortation, but being himself very earnest, having this desire, he went out to you of his own accord. Again, he was not told to go do this. And I can tell people what needs to be done. But honestly, one of the biggest things I look for is if somebody will simply see what needs to be done and go do it. So the animated movie Robots, this is one of the phrases in there, right? Mr. Bigwell, you know, this famous inventor, there's a whole story there I won't get into. It's not necessary, but you know, he had an expression, see a need, fill a need. And that doesn't take an office, that doesn't take a title, it doesn't take anything except the heart to go serve. And so Paul's kind of introducing Titus to them, but also praising Titus, not in a wrong way. He's just acknowledging what Titus has the heart to do. He accepted this because he's earnest, he's very desirous, and of his own accord he went to go help. Verse 18, we have sent together with him the brother whose praise in the gospel is known throughout the assemblies or the churches. Now, there's no end of speculation as to who this other person was. It's not Titus. Titus is mentioned by name here. So many have wondered, is it Silas? Is it Barnabas? Is it Timothy? Is it Trophimus? He's mentioned in Acts 20 and other places, traveling with Paul as well. He's not very well known. But whoever it is, notice what it says in verse 19. Not only so, but he was also appointed by the churches to travel with us in this grace. So he had a reputation. And the churches, when they sent Paul out, when they backed him up and helped give him resources to go do this, they wanted this other individual to go with him because they knew he would also be there to serve. So he said that he was appointed by the churches to travel with us in this grace or graciousness, which is served by us to the glory of the Lord himself and to show our readiness. So it was not just somebody tagging along to fulfill administrative needs. or whatever it was. He wasn't a tag along. This individual went to serve like Titus. They wanted to go do this. And so verse 20, we are avoiding this, that any man should blame us according to this abundance. Now, what Paul is saying here is that he, and maybe even a certain few others, they deliberately did not come to insert themselves in this collection. This is part of why he's sending Titus and this brother, whoever this brother is. And we'll get to the reason why here in a moment. But he says we're avoiding this, that any man should blame us concerning this abundance which is administered by us. He did not want to have the appearance of evil. He knew, because he already had critics, he knew that if he was in the middle of this, and it must have been a fairly sizable contribution that had been collected. So whatever resources, whatever money was available, he did not want to take away from what the Corinthian members had done. He did not want to give occasion that anyone could accuse him of either taking advantage of things or to be self-serving or to even, kind of to use our expression, skimming off the top. He just stayed away from it. This is at 1 Thessalonians 5, I think, where it talks about even avoiding the appearance of evil. This is what Paul was doing. He knew that if he went down there, it would take away from what good was being done. And so he didn't need to. So he didn't. He sent somebody like Titus and this other individual who had stellar reputations. And so verse 21, having regard for honorable things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. This is, in my mind, this is referencing both Titus and this other individual. Having regard for honorable things, to do the right thing, even if it's not convenient or it's not comfortable. Paul very well could have gone down there. He would have had a number of other reasons that would have justified him being there, but he deliberately avoided it because he wanted it to be honorable. He wanted it to have the appearance of doing the right thing, because it was. But he says, notice, not only in the sight of God, but also in the sight of men, to be above board on all things. So I want to read to you 2 Peter 2 there. Second Peter 2, I'm sorry, 1 Peter. That's reading my own notes. 1 Peter 2 and in verse 12. Peter writes here, he says, to them it was revealed, not to themselves, but to us. They were ministering the things which we now have been reported to you through those who have preached the gospel to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things which angels desire to look into. I'm sorry, that's chapter 1. Chapter 12, 2, verse 12, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works which they observe glorify God in the day of visitation. So it's not that we won't get criticized even if we do the right thing. Oftentimes we'll still get criticized for doing the right thing. But when they stand before God, they're not going to be able to hold that opinion because God knows. And this is, again, verse 19. We do it to honor and glorify God and to show our readiness. But we avoid the appearance of evil if we can. So then we do it for the right reasons. Sometimes the right reasons is not being involved, like Paul here. Sometimes the right reason is to go serve because they are doing such a great job and you want to help them. And there are many other ways we could look at that. And so, again, in verse 22, he's referencing back to Titus. So we have sent with them our brother. So with Titus, and evidently there were others as well, but this other individual, whom we have many times proved earnest in many things. So whoever this person was, going back to my earlier point, they had a stellar reputation of serving God and his people. They were dedicated, they were doctrinally sound, they had a desire to serve, a heart to serve. So he says, but now much more earnest, which much more desire by reason of great confidence which he has in you, The desire was to support them doing the good thing, which goes back to my earlier point when we first started. Catch them doing good is a great principle for raising children. It's easy to criticize, but we can also use that principle in all kinds of interpersonal relationships. Catch them doing good. Praise the things they do well. Praise the things they do right, because there's also another component to this. Because it's encouraging, it validates the behavior you want to see. I mean, think about it. How much does God praise us, if you will? Because he wants us to continue. Part of the blessing, part of the benefit of the blessing that God gives us is because he wants us to be encouraged to continue doing the right thing. And Paul's mentioning this here as well. Because of their desire to serve, because of their heart to be obedient and submissive to God's instruction, these individuals had an even more earnest desire to be a part of what the Corinthians were doing, to support them and to help them. But they're doing it, notice, because of the great confidence they have in you. It is like receiving a thank you card out of the blue. It's just such a shot in the arm. All of us like to hear praise, and it can't be, what's the word I'm looking for? Can't be faint praise. It can't be, just we're not honest about it. We're not sincere about it. It has to be true. But if it's unprovoked, that's not the right word. If it's unsolicited, if it's not generated because we want it, somebody acknowledges it from the side, then it means something, doesn't it? Especially if we weren't doing it for any other reason except to serve, and then we see how it helped. So this is what Paul's talking about here with Titus and these others. This is what we should emulate in our service. My perspective, again, for what it's worth, my perspective on those whom I consider ordaining, whether it's deacon, deaconess, elder, that really becomes a point of acknowledging what they've already done in the past. And because there's such a pattern there, that they can help facilitate more of that with others within the congregation. But like Moses said to Joshua when all those individuals began prophesying, and Joshua was a little put out, told Moses to make them stop. And you remember what Moses said? He said, I wish the whole camp of Israel would prophesy. I wish the whole church would reflect here what Titus is known for, what this brother is known for. Because even in the Roman culture, this kind of selfless love and service, that was not the norm. That was not what came out of the Roman culture. The Roman culture was very self-centered, like so many cultures are apart from God. So then verse 23, as for Titus, he is my partner and fellow worker for you. And this is sort of a public recognition, a public declaration that Paul is entrusting Titus, and I have confidence in what he will do. The Church of God, up until probably the late 1800s, and as Mr. Armstrong began to be used by God in the early to mid 1900s, for the most part, the Church of God functioned with what we would call letters of reference. They all kind of knew of each other, but it was very localized for the most part. But it doesn't mean that they wouldn't help each other. Even going back up to what we talked about earlier, that as they saw needs, whether it was spiritual or physical, they would try to reach out and help as they could in other areas. And oftentimes what would happen is that if representatives from one area was sent to another area, they would literally take like a letter of reference. Here are these individuals. This is who they are. And it was usually signed by somebody who would be known between these groups. There would usually be, like we would call him a senior pastor, somebody sort of in charge of a region or territory not in charge in the sense that he ruled it, but he was kind of recognized as being the patriarch spiritually. And so they had some reputation. They were known, and they would send individuals, and they would say essentially what Paul is saying here. He's my partner and fellow worker for you. Allow him to help or provide means for him or whatever it happened to be. So this is what Paul's doing here with Titus as he sends him down to Corinth. He says, as for our brothers, they are the apostles of the assemblies, the churches. They are the apostles of the churches, the glory of Christ. So like a Epaphroditus in Philippians. They're apostles in the sense that they're sent. That's what apostle means, one sent. It doesn't mean that they're apostles in the sense of like the 12, or like Paul was, or like Barnabas was later on, or others that we read of in terms of having a title, but in terms of service. They're sent out to the churches, and the churches are the glory of Christ. Right? They're not our churches. They're not our members. We don't own any of this, because it all comes from God. And this is, again, another point that Paul's making here. So then to finish the chapter here, verse 24, therefore show the proof of your love to them. Now, this is not, don't hear this in terms of any kind of harshness. He's simply saying them, as he said earlier, just show them who you are. Just continue doing what you're doing. Show them the proof of your love. And the proof of your love is in your actions. It can be in your words, but more than anything else, it's in the actions. Because we can say all day long, if we don't do it, it's meaningless. So he said, there, show them the proof of your love before the churches and of our boasting on your behalf. Don't make me look stupid here. Paul's kind of saying, he's not being that hard about it, but he says, look, I know you guys. I know you'll do this. But show them why I'm boasting on you in the right way. So if you read through some of the commentaries, one of the things that comes up, and I don't get it, but it's out there. Some think that Titus and Timothy were the same individuals. There are a number of verses there that you could see on the screen in Corinthians, especially 1st and 2nd Corinthians. I don't see them as the same person. Why would there be two different letters written if it was the same person? Otherwise, we would have 3rd Timothy or 3rd whatever instead of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. I just throw that out there to just kind of give some of that information so you know what some say. You have individuals who really don't believe the Bible in terms of any kind of truth or life-changing instruction. They see it more as a scholarly work, and that's where you'll get some of this. They kind of pick at the weeds, and they're looking for something that no one's figured out before, and so that floats out there from time to time. So that's 2 Corinthians. Paul praises them at the beginning for this collection.